Welcome to Inside Report. I'm your host, Bruce Schlussman. With me today, we have a leading investigative reporter in the United States, John Solomon from The Hill. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Glad to be here. Good to be with the team at Judicial Watch.
So as one of the top investigative reporters who's been doing so much work in this arena, investigating this whole Russian collusion narrative, investigating all of Spygate and everything that's been going on, when did you first notice something was wrong?
It's funny. I was back in March of 2017. The Russia story was at that point sort of raging for a couple of months. And there was a filing in the FISA court. Very rare to have a public filing in the FISA court. And so it said at the end of the Obama administration, the NSA, FBI walked in scores, if not hundreds, if I recall correctly, of violations, that there were spy violations going on, specifically affecting the Americans' privacy. And I had not seen a filing like this in a long time. I watched the FISA court a lot. It was very harsh in its assessment, and it was very broad in the scope of violations. And most importantly, there was a significant suggestion that some of this occurred during the 2016 election. So I wrote a series of stories. I came off Hannity one night talking about that story, and I pull into my driveway, and there are two blue government sedans sitting in front of my mailbox, like 11 o'clock at night. I pull in the driveway, guys get out of the car, kind of figure there's something up, and they approach me and say, "You John Solomon?" I said, "I am." I said, "Well, we just saw you on television. We want to talk to you for a second. You're on the cusp of something much bigger, and we can't tell you much because most of the information is classified. What we can tell you is that if you dig far enough, you will find that the U.S. intelligence community, the FBI, the NSA, were used to carry out a political opposition research project during the 2016 election. We're deeply troubled by that. It's inappropriate. There are violations yet to be discovered. And more importantly, the reason we want to come and tell you and hope you can report this out is that if we lose these tools, because we're caught using them for politics, we might not catch the next terrorist, we might not catch the next big spy. It deeply concerns us to see what happened. We can't tell you anything more than that except go get them." And so I had this weird interlude in the driveway. I went home, went inside the house, quickly typed up everything I could remember from the conversation, sent it to my colleague at the time, Sarah Carter, and we began reporting out, could there have been a political dirty trick? Could the U.S. intelligence community have been involved? Who was involved? What politics was involved? Was it Trump? Is it Clinton? We don't know yet. Mm-hmm. And over time, we began to connect these various ligaments and tissues to a very large skeleton. And that skeleton was the FBI was used to carry out basically a political dirty trick on Donald Trump, and to create the illusion that there was this collusion going on when in fact almost everybody in the intelligence community that was not politicized thought this was very thin, if not inappropriate investigation. And little by little, then the Steele dossier came out. Then through the great work of Judicial Watch and other transparency advocates, and through people like Jim Jordan, Mark Meadows, Chuck Grassley, Devin Nunes, we began to see the confines of a real scandal. And the scandal wasn't that Russia and Trump had colluded. It was that the Democratic National Committee, Hillary Clinton, their researchers, their British intelligence operative was colluding with the intelligence agencies to try to create the appearance of such a collusion scandal on the other side. Deeply troubling. And at the beginning, very few people really paid attention to what we were reporting. But over time, and now that the Mueller report has basically put a fork in the idea that there was collusion, people are looking back with eyes and looking at the reporting myself and Sarah and many other people have done, and realizing that maybe the media and the intelligence community were taken for a political ride.
So not to get caught in the weeds, but
Yep.
Those two people, did you ever find out who they were?
Never saw them again. They never gave me their names. They never told me anything about who they were. They were in a blue sedan. I think it had government plates. That's my recollection. Never saw them again. When they first pulled in the driveway, I remember my wife saw me pulling in. She opened up the curtain. She saw the guys approach. She closed the curtains back and left me out there on my own. So I don't know what would have happened if it was a nefarious moment. But I think they were just patriots, Americans concerned that they want to do their job. They want to use these spy tools to catch spies and terrorists, and not to be in the game of politics. And at that moment, I didn't know whether it was a trick or a thing, but I look back at their words that I memorialized that night, and they were very, very accurate. They understood what was going on, and whatever their venue was, whatever their motivation for whistleblowing was, it was a fairly significant tip that led to a lot of great opportunity for us to report.
So the Christopher Steele dossier, being that British spy that you were referencing, the Steele dossier, also known as the Trump dossier, how involved was that piece of evidence in the whole building of this Russian probe and the whole building of like the basis of these warrants that they obtained in a spy court?
It's a great question. We now know from the testimony of Andrew McCabe that without the Steele dossier, they would not have gotten the FISA warrant to spy on Carter Page in the final weeks of the campaign. And when we say he was spying on Carter Page, obviously he's the focus of the warrant. But once you have those surveillance powers, you can go back legally and recreate all of his conversations inside the campaign. And you look at how wide-ranging the intrusion was on the campaign. You know, dozens of witnesses inside the campaign, the transition in the White House, ultimately were interviewed. Well, how do they make those connections? Because through Carter Page, they were able to build a spider out to find these things. So it really was spying on the Trump campaign through the one lens of Carter Page. Without that, Andrew McCabe says they wouldn't have been able to do the FISA. The FBI says it started its information with George Papadopoulos and a tip that came in from Australia on July 24th. They opened the case on July 31st of 2016. That seems plausible from the early memo that we've seen, but now we've seen a lot more other information coming in. Christopher Steele actually walks his first dossier into the FBI in London on July 5th. Ironically, the very same day that James Comey announces that he's clearing Hillary Clinton of these espionage charges. And then on July 30th, we know that Christopher Steele meets with Bruce and Nellie Orr. Bruce, the Associate Deputy Attorney General, very senior in the Justice Department. Nellie, working for the same firm as Christopher Steele, Fusion GPS. They talk all day about, or all morning and over breakfast about what he's found. What does Bruce Orr do the next day? He calls July 31st. He calls the Deputy FBI Director, Andrew McCabe, tells him what he's got going, and it's that day that they open the investigation. Maybe they choose to open it on Papadopoulos, but it's impossible to see the opening of this case without Steele's intervention surrounding it. And then Steele drives us towards the FISA warrant, the remarkable event in October.
I'm so glad you brought up the FISA court hearings and everything that happened with. What was your reaction to seeing that Judicial Watch release that there were no hearings held about this?
It's a pretty remarkable thing if you consider what the judges were being asked to do, which is to intervene in the final weeks of an election to spy on a campaign of a duly nominated and elected Republican candidate for president based on information that came from his opponent. It is remarkable that the court didn't give more scrutiny. Now, there could have been conversations outside the hearings that we don't know about, ex parte, but it does not look like there was a very strong pushback, questioning of the evidence. And that seems so much more consequential today for this reason. What do we now know about the Steele dossier? It couldn't be corroborated. So that means the vast majority of evidence that was supporting this extraordinary request to spy on a presidential candidate in the final days of the campaign was unverified, and the court didn't ask any questions, didn't have any hearings, didn't do any pushback, and then renewed it 3 times without any pushback, without any questions, without any hearings. I think that was one of the most important pieces that goes to, do we have a FISA court that's aggressive enough? Are they really asking the sort of questions that will protect my privacy, your privacy, Americans' privacies when these sort of issues come up? The FISA court is the only court in America where the accused has no representation. It relies on an honor system, and if the government doesn't live by that honor system, if it doesn't tell the court, hey, we got this information from Hillary Clinton's opposition research vendor, hey, he had some problems, he was leaking to the media, if we don't tell those things in real time to the court flies blind about its opportunity to protect the innocent or accused person and their privacy. And so I think that release of that information was very consequential. And it's raised real questions in my mind. Is the FISA court being aggressive enough in protecting Americans' privacy?
So I want to back up to Peter Strzok and everything that was going on. There was an email or communication between him and presumably Andrew McCabe that talked about an insurance policy. Do you want to tell us about what that means and kind of what that means in far as all of the scandal? We
don't really know yet what it means because there are varying testimonies about what it is, and also people say they couldn't recall what he meant. But I think the most cogent interpretation of the insurance policy, and remember when it is, it's in early August. What we've learned in my reporting and other people's reporting is that by early August, the predicate against George Papadopoulos, the real reason they opened the Operation Crossfire Hurricane, was that it was beginning to erode. They were beginning to get information that suggested that Papadopoulos didn't really know about the leak of the documents and may not have even, and may have told an informant by Papadopoulos' own account that I would never have been involved in the leaking and we would never use the material or encourage a hack because it would be treason in my mind. He made that statement. So that whole concept of Papadopoulos as the hacker conspirator goes away quickly. They need something else to keep this case going. And I think that insurance policy is we're going to pivot from Papadopoulos. And how do we know they pivoted from Papadopoulos? After opening up on Papadopoulos, they don't try to interview him for 7 months. If he was so critical, you think they might go and talk to him right away. They pivot right away to the Steele dossier. And I think the insurance policy is a combination of, all right, we're going to use Steele dossier, but it's got some problems. It's connected to Hillary Clinton. It's unverified. And they're going to insert these informants, like the ones we just learned about yesterday from the New York Times, the Turkish American woman that poses as an assistant to Stefan Halper, another FBI informant, to bulk up what is obviously a political document. If they can get enough information from those informants, they'll have an insurance policy to pivot from Papadopoulos to the allegations of the Steele memo. And I believe that really is it. A lot of people have said, well, it's an insurance policy. If Donald Trump gets elected, then we'll take him out. There's no evidence that that was the plan, because all throughout the back end of the election, they're still trying to take out Donald Trump with this investigation. I think the insurance policy is much more specific to how an FBI agent thinks. All right, I've opened an investigation. My initial predicate is starting to fall apart. I want to pivot to this other thing because it's a lot sexier, a lot more meat to it, but it comes from a political rival. So I got to bulk that up in some way to justify to the court why I'm going to continue spying on the Trump campaign. And I think it's the use of informants and other invasive tactics in the final days of the election that is the insurance policy that they're referring. That's the best interpretation I've seen of it.
So is there anyone that's asking the important questions with this whole dossier and how what seemingly it's almost laundering information through it? Anyone asking these questions? Is anyone ringing the alarm bells over there?
Yeah, it's been a little slow to ring the alarm bell. A lot of the barn was burned down already, but now that we're past that point, yes. The Inspector General of the Justice Department has an ongoing and I think very wide-ranging investigation of how the FISA was obtained, the quality of the evidence that was used, whether it was appropriate to renew it 3 times, and whether anyone intentionally intended to mislead the court by not telling them the nature of the documentation or the source of the information or the flaws with the guy who we now know to be the primary informant, Christopher Steele. That's one investigation. Attorney General Barr made clear he's got his own investigation, and it's broader than the issues that the IG is looking at. As a whole, did the intelligence community act inappropriately? And then third, we've got Lindsey Graham, new chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, making very clear that he's going to hold the hearings. And if you looked at the way he walked Barr through his initial questioning earlier this week, do you agree with me, sir, that there might have been abuses of the FISA process? Yes, I do. That's a very strong, powerful statement by the Attorney General, who has all the visibility that we don't have, the documents that are still classified. That's the third line of accountability. The fourth line of accountability will be when the president declassifies these documents, and journalists like myself and groups like Judicial Watch and other members of Congress who don't sit on the intelligence committee can see the breadth of evidence that was hidden behind closed doors for 3 years and where the flaws in this investigation might really lie. So that's the circle of accountability that is forthcoming.
So Rosenstein just resigned, and a lot of people are kind of wondering what happens to him now that he's quote unquote out of the picture. I want to talk a little bit about his conflicts of interest. Would you mind discussing that, walking us through what some of those were?
He's clearly one of the most interesting characters in the saga, particularly the second half of the Russian saga. He's really not involved in the beginning of the investigation when Strzok and Page, go for the FISA warrant. He's not yet Deputy Attorney General. But I want to wind him back to a much earlier time frame when he's U.S. Attorney in Maryland and Baltimore.
Okay.
And at that point, he oversees the prosecution of a case involving Russia's largest nuclear company, Rosatom. And Rosatom, as we now know, had was allowed by the Obama administration to buy a company called Uranium One that had 25% of the assets underground of America's uranium. If you look today, if you talk to the energy experts in the uranium field, about 40% of America's, according to them, 40% of America's uranium is coming directly or indirectly through Russia now. So our nuclear power plants are highly reliant now on Russian fuel in a way they weren't 10 years ago. And that concerns a lot of people in the intelligence community and others. But how did we get to that point? Well, Barack Obama's administration said, you, Rosatom, Russian-controlled nuclear company, can buy this company, Uranium One. But more importantly, we're going to authorize you to have billions of dollars of new contracts with our nuclear power plants. This was part of a Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama plan to reboot the relationship with Russia. Well, the reset went really well for Vladimir Putin, didn't go so well for the United States. Rod Rosenstein is the U.S. attorney of a prosecution that ultimately, in 2014, proved that Rosatom, that company we just gave all those billions of dollars of nuclear contracts to, was involved in kickbacks, extortion, bribery, and racketeering. And they ultimately plead out the American chief of Rosatom in a series of charges in 14 and 15. But what we now know is that the FBI already knew all of that information in 2009 and 2010 before the Obama administration gave permission to Rosatom to buy Uranium One's assets, and more importantly, to give them billions of dollars of preferred contracts with America's nuclear companies, which made us more dependent on Russian nuclear strategy. You dig into that file, the very file that Rod Rosenstein had in his hands when he prosecuted that man, there's a strategy document by Rosatom, and it says, we, the Russians, want to make America more dependent on Russian uranium to gain geopolitical strength over the United States, just like we use natural gas in the Western and Eastern Europe to make Eastern Europe more dependent on Russian natural gas. So monopolization of an energy market so that we can have the upper hand geopolitically against the United States, make the United States more reliant on Russia. That has actually happened. Barack Obama's administration facilitated that happening. In the face of evidence, at least the FBI had it, that Rosatom was doing this and it was engaged in criminality, why it was doing this. Rod Rosenstein has never been forced to answer what he knew, when he knew it, and why weren't more flags raised to the American public about that transaction. Now you spring ahead, he gets into the Deputy Attorney General's office. Very quickly, Jeff Sessions is recused because of a meeting he had or attendance at a meeting he had with the Russian ambassador. And he's in charge of this remarkable investigation. And he signs the fourth renewal of the FISA warrant. He writes the justification for the president, tells the president it's okay to fire James Comey because he was a bad egg on the Hillary Clinton investigation. Then turns around, if you believe the FBI's notes and the FBI's testimony, and the FBI's written account in books, and suggests, I can't believe the president just fired James Comey, oh, by the way, on my word, and we need to investigate him for obstruction. And maybe I'll wear a wire on the president, and we can remove him from the office under arguments of a 25th Amendment. He's become mentally incapacitated as president. Having that role, he now becomes a fact witness and an operative in the obstruction probe that he just approved. He's a witness and he's supervising the probe. And he navigates that probe for 2 years to avoid his own exposure. Even when Republicans wanted to call him last fall, remember when they had control of the House still? Paul Ryan wouldn't let them summon Rosenstein to the Congress to answer questions. He has escaped the sort of questioning that an American in that position with those conflicts should have faced real questioning. I think that questioning will occur now with Lindsey Graham and the new Senate Judiciary Committee.
Rosenstein was obviously at the center of that whole discussion about invoking a possible coup attempt. Would you say that's like, would you tell us a little bit about that conversation and what can be done about it?
We only know one side of it. So as a journalist, you always want both sides. You want stereo visibility into what happened. Rosenstein really hasn't told us what happened in that his side of it. But if you believe Andy McCabe, who, by the way, has been shown to have lied in a prior investigation, and you believe Pete Strzok and Lisa Page's recounting in emails and documents, it appears that the FBI and Rosenstein had this conversation after Comey was fired, and they considered a range of options. How can we retaliate against the president for firing our buddy James Comey? At that point, it's not clear the FBI knew that Rosenstein was complicitous in getting Comey fired because he wrote the memo saying he was a bad egg on the Clinton investigation. We should fire him for performance. And keep in mind, that turns out to be an accurate description because the IG investigated it, and just like Rosenstein, the IG properly concluded that Comey acted badly in the Clinton email case, and there was grounds for firing him. So Rosenstein writes a perfect memo to give, a good performance memo that justifies the president's decision. Then he turns around and acts to the FBI as though, oh my God, you've been victimized, and I'm here to help you retaliate against Donald Trump, if you believe the FBI's account. Until we get Rod Rosenstein's account, we don't know. But what the FBI said is Rosenstein volunteered to wear a wire on our president, wear a recording device, going to the president, try to gather some evidence that he was insane or obstructive or whatever they were looking for. And then they would talk to a couple of cabinet members inside the cabinet and begin this very rare process, which has never been used in American history, to invoke the 25th Amendment and try to remove the president because he was, quote unquote, incapacitated. If the FBI's account is accurate, and we should take it with a grain of salt since at least one of the accountees is somebody who's already been caught lying. But if it's accurate, Rod Rosenstein was on both sides of this equation, fanning Donald Trump's desire to fire James Comey and then fanning the FBI's desire to get revenge against him by opening up an obstruction case and maybe even considering wearing a wire and removing him under the Constitution. It's a crazy period in American history. I don't think the final volume of history has been written yet. Maybe groups like Judicial Watch can help us get those documents. Maybe Congress can use its subpoena power, but we need to know more about what occurred there. If the FBI's account is accurate, it feels like a coup attempt. But one of the things we learned about the Russia investigation is we should give, because our American system requires it, the benefit of innocence to people who have yet been convicted. We didn't do that during the Trump. Carter Page was assumed guilty right away, so was Papadopoulos. In the end of the day, we find out a lot of that stuff wasn't true, Donald Trump. But let's assume everyone's innocent, but we should get to the bottom of it and find out who did what. And Rod Rosenstein, I think, has a lot of questions to answer, both about Rosatom, 2009, and 2017-18, and what he did with the FBI.
So I don't want to, we're almost out of time here, but I wanted to talk about your story that you wrote recently about DNC contractors in Ukraine to meet with Petro Poroshenko, president of Ukraine, about digging up Russia or Trump Russia dirt.
Right.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about that story?
Yeah, so it's been out there, rumored, because of very good sort of reporting that occurred in January 2017 at Politico. But at the time, we were in such a Russia hysteria, the story didn't really sink into people. It was pretty remarkable. But at that time, they suggested that there was a DNC operative, a paid consultant contractor named Ali Chalupa, who went to the Russia embassy and asked for dirt on Donald Trump, specifically trying to connect Manafort to Russia through Ukraine. And as we know, that successfully became a story in the public domain. Since Politico last reported that 2 years ago, and then it sort of faded away from everyone's memory, some significant events have occurred in Ukraine, some of it through my reporting. In December of last year, one of Ukraine's highest courts ruled that two members of Ukraine's government, the head of the FBI, the NABU, and the head of, or a key member of parliament, member of Congress in our terminology, wrongly and illegally intervened in the US election by leaking documents about Paul Manafort. Ironically, the same information that Politico said that DNC operative was trying to get her hands on. So there's a formal ruling. A foreign power has now admitted some of its members of its government wrongly intervened in the US election. Let's fast forward now. We go back, the Ukraine embassy was sort of silent. Did this really happen, like Politico said? We've never heard from the ambassador in a substantive way. The most he said in 17 and 18 was, I didn't interfere in the election. It's all bogus. So I asked him specifically, did this happen? Did Chalupa really come in? Did she really ask for dirt on Paul Manafort? How'd you react to it? Is there anything else that she did? We learned something new. Beyond what Politico reported, first he confirms it. Yes, Chalupa came in. I didn't even know she was DNC at the time. I thought she was a Ukrainian-American activist. I later learned she was DNC. And she did ask us for dirt on Manafort. We thought it was highly inappropriate. She also asked to get our president, Ukraine's president, then Petro Poroshenko, to come to the United States and make some comments with a reporter trying to fan the flames of this Paul Manafort investigation. And we thought it was inappropriate. We said no. Now, there's a dispute inside the Ukrainian community whether they really said no, because one of the ambassador's top aides says, I did all the research. I went through and I swept all of the Ukrainian intelligence files for all the dirt I had on Donald Trump, found some good stuff. I didn't feel right as the Ukraine political officer, this guy Teleshenko tells me, to give it to her. I think it would have been illegal. So I gave it to the ambassador, and I don't know what happened to it. Well, they at least went through the effort, if you believe Teleshenko, to dig up the dirt. So they went and found it. No matter what happened, we can follow the story beyond what the embassy says. In May, due to a WikiLeaks leaked email, we know that Chalupa, the DNC contractor, wrote back to her DNC bosses and said, I'm really getting some progress on this Manafort thing. I just was in Ukraine. I met with 68 Ukrainian investigative journalists to tell them to work on Manafort. And I brought Michael Isikoff, the American journalist who probably had more than anyone else to do with creating the Russian narrative in the media. I met with him and I got him interested in Manafort. And oh, by the way, there's something secret I need to tell you that's about to come out in Ukraine. That's May 3rd, she writes that email. May 29th, Ukrainian authorities released the Black Ledger allegedly implicating Manafort in all this wrongdoing. That becomes one of the main threads of the Russian narrative. And it is that event, that May 29th release of those documents, that Ukraine's court has now ruled was an illegal intervention in the United States. It seems to suggest that Chalupa seemed to know about this forthcoming event. That's why it matters. And there's now the question is, will people like Senate Intelligence, House Intelligence look at this episode with the same vigor that they looked at all the Russia stuff? Remains to be seen.
Well, thank you so much for coming by and walking us through all of this. This has been really enlightening.
Thank you very much. It's as a journalist, it's great to be associated or to work with groups like Judicial Watch and people on all sides of the political spectrum that try to get transparency in a government where there's so much secrecy. So what you guys do here benefits my profession, and it's real fun to be able to talk about the consequences of all these release of documents now.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for coming by.
Great to be here.
Thank you so much for joining us on Inside Report here today. If you like this video and you support our work, please visit our website, donate, watch other videos, subscribe to us on YouTube, like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and of course, please be sure to check out other episodes of Inside Report and Inside Judicial Watch. Thank you so much for joining us here today.